You're right, guys, and welcome to the latest episode of Muscle Owl Talks. I'm here today with Zoe Hallam, and it's Limb Girdle Awareness Day, World Limb Girdle Awareness Day. And we just thought we did an episode last year talking about limb girdle awareness and what it's all about. And there can be misconceptions around the condition as to how it compares to other types of disabilities, but then also how it compares to other types of muscular dystrophy. I don't know. I see it as, obviously, for people who don't know, my brother has Duchenne muscular dystrophy, so that's how I've always been involved in the community. And I think Duchenne muscular dystrophy, even though it can be quite varied, it has a particular progression that you can, and a trajectory that you can see. And I think from that background, I can often have misconceptions about other types of muscular dystrophies sometimes when I see certain things and I think, oh, well, that'll be similar. Limb girdle muscular dystrophy with so many different types is really varied, isn't it? But also, in terms of the muscles that it affects, it's also very particular compared to other sorts of muscular dystrophies. I don't know, Zoe, what's all that about?
Yeah, I think really you summed it up quite well. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about limb girdle from people who sort of know a little bit about muscular dystrophy is that it's kind of one condition that affects everyone in similar ways. Actually, it's a really broad range of that manifest in quite different ways and at quite different times for different people. And I think that's why it's quite difficult to engage on the topic of limb girdle, because a lot of people experience it in very different ways. I mean, I have an undiagnosed form of limb girdle, so nobody really knows what that means for me and how it's going to change and progress as my life goes on. But what we do know is sort of roughly the sort of types of muscles that will be affected and the types of muscles that probably won't be affected. But that's kind of as specific as you can often get with limb girdle, because it's such a varied condition. So I mean, I've been using a wheelchair for about 10 years. I was diagnosed with limb girdle when I was 10. You get some people who are diagnosed in their 40s and 50s and never lose the ability to walk. There's such a broad spectrum. But sort of, I guess, medically speaking, what you're looking at with limb girdle is a weakness and a sort of degenerative to a point weakness of the muscles around the sort of shoulders and around the hips. So that tends to be why people lose their ability to walk, because their hip muscles get too weak to support their weight and they end up using a wheelchair. But plenty of people can walk with 6 or with other mobility aids for quite a long time, if not forever. So when you think of what a typical limb girdle sufferer might look like, there's no real picture you can form. Unlike, I guess, some other forms of muscular dystrophy, such as Duchenne, where the sort of typical person with Duchenne is a young man who uses a wheelchair. It is quite a clear image, I think, for a lot of people about what that condition is. Limb girdle is very different, because you have two people with limb girdle who are different genders, different races, have different degrees of mobility, different courses of treatment, different adaptations that they need in their lives. It's a very difficult one to pin down. But it always reflects is any professionals who are involved with my care or with my ongoing sort of health monitoring, because they just have about as much idea as I do about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, do you get that from when you see doctors and things like that? Because, I mean, it's a progression of muscle deterioration, but it's a progression that's so specific to certain parts. Do they often think it will be to other muscles, or are they often a bit sometimes confused if they don't know what it's like?
Yeah, certainly for doctors and other people who aren't familiar with the conditions, the fact that it's so localized is a really weird one for them. I'll often, my consultant understands the condition pretty well, but often I'll go in there and he'll have a student doctor or a junior doctor with him observing, and they're always fascinated by the fact that I have such pronounced weakness in certain muscle groups. My upper arm strength is basically 0, but if you actually measure my lower arm strength, it's on par with any able-bodied person, and those muscles are absolutely fine, despite the fact that the top of my arms, I can't do anything with it. It's the same thing, if you look at my ankles versus my knees and things like that. It's a real surprise, I think, to a lot of people just how localized it really is. I mean, some forms of limb girdle you do get involvement with other muscle groups. You can get some heart involvement or difficulty swallowing and things like that. But certainly my particular my particular brand of Limb Girdle, it is literally just these muscle groups that are affected. And I'm not saying that doesn't have an impact, because obviously it does, because they're pretty major muscle groups. But in terms of all of the other kind of side effects that often go with disability, I don't get into many of those because it's such a it's such a specific condition.
And in terms of, I think the stat is something like 25% of people who have limb girdle muscular dystrophy have an undiagnosed type of limb girdle muscular dystrophy, because obviously we have limb girdle 2A, 2B, 2L, all these. And obviously you don't know your specific type. I don't know, what's that like? Is it a nuisance to you, or is it just something that's, okay?
I guess it doesn't really bother me that much anymore. I think partially because for the last, 5 years or maybe even longer, my condition's been very stable. So not very much has changed in terms of my ability to do or not do things. I think that's just because I've developed, ways of doing things. I use a wheelchair and I do things in a way that I don't rely on those groups of muscles at all, really. So any kind of change in their strength, you don't really notice it on a day-to-day basis, because you don't notice not being able to do things because I plan not to be able to do them anyway. Mm-hmm. So I don't really think about the fact that they don't really know what it is. Mm-hmm. And so kind of consistent, really, in its progression for my whole life. And as I say, for the last 2 years, touch wood, it hasn't changed at all. I still go and do all my checkups and see all my doctors and things, just to keep an eye on things. But I'm at the point now where I'll go to my consultant, and it takes me longer to get there, and often waiting in the waiting room longer than the appointment actually takes, because sort of go in and say hello, and then he says, how are things? And I say, oh, fine, nothing's really changed, and then I go home again. So it's
I guess that is the downside to not having a specific diagnosis, is you can't necessarily say, okay, well, this is how it's going to affect. This is what's
there's no checklist of what to look out for, I guess, in terms of here's what might happen next, or here are the possible routes it might take. But I think even if I did have a diagnosed form of limb girdle, it's degenerative only really up to a point, because, as I say, because it only affects these certain muscles. Once you've kind of got to the point where you can't do anything with them, then any further degeneration, it's pretty immaterial, right? It doesn't change anything, and there's not actually that many ways of really observing it. And I don't think that would change very much in terms of how it's handled and how it's managed.
Yeah. As a final note, what I always say is, what would you say to someone who received a diagnosis tomorrow? I know, I guess that's quite a hard thing to answer, because, again, as we've said, it's so varied. There could be someone watching who's maybe the parent of a 9-year-old child who's just received a diagnosis of limb girdle. There could be a 25-year-old man who's, watching and has just received a completely different type of diagnosis. I don't know. Were you 12 when you received your diagnosis, and then 10, and then you started using a wheelchair
at about 16.
So, I don't know, you've got a completely different situation. I don't know, could you give some advice to someone who's just been diagnosed? What would we say?
I guess the important thing is to educate yourself. If you've got a diagnosis, then you've got a starting point in terms of trying to understand what it might mean and how it might affect you. And as with any condition like this, it's important to try and plan ahead as much as you can, and try and think about what your life might be in 5 years, 10 years. And for me, that was a really important thing about growing up, was my parents were very good at that, and they made sure that I had everything I needed before I needed it. So things like getting a lift in the house, starting to use a wheelchair before it became point where I physically couldn't go out without a wheelchair, doing all of that stuff. And it's a difficult mental thing to get over, because you don't feel like you're ready, or you're in a place where you need to do this stuff. But the thing with limb girdle is, as I say, what is predictable in terms of the muscle groups it affects, and sort of technically what happens. The whys and whens and hows of that are very different for everyone. So trying to kind of be a little bit of a step ahead of the game and start taking measures that will help you before you really, really need them. So for me, I started using a wheelchair before I absolutely desperately needed to. When we would go on holiday as a family, I'd use a wheelchair then, just to get around, make make the holidaying experience a lot less support for everyone. And then I started going to school on my wheelchair and then packing it up like in the classroom and then walking around while I was. So kind of taking those smaller steps really helped me then cope with the bigger ones, which were when suddenly, I can't walk very fast, so I do need to use a wheelchair now. That's just the thing. But because I've already been using it, not such a big crisis. And I think that's the thing, because you don't really know with limb girdle how quickly things are going to progress, or which bits of you are going to start not working as, in what order, then understanding what the likely progression of the condition is and take the steps early on to sort of mitigate the risks that you're putting yourself at, then that really helps, I think, manage the deterioration at whatever speed it happens. If you're 5 years too early, then it's not a big deal. If you're 5 years too early
yeah. Be prepared, but be positive.
Yeah, exactly.
That's it. I like it. It seems to have served you well. That's really good. Awesome. Yeah, what a good episode. What a good explanatory episode for World Limb Girdle Awareness Day 2017. Thanks guys for watching. And if you're first time watching Muscle Out, tune in to more of our episodes. We chat about a variety of different things. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks guys. Bye.
Bye.